Cityworks Expo is a collaborative, co-creative, and multidisciplinary idea exchange and festival conference that happens each fall in Roanoke, Virginia. By day, attendees are immersed in thought-provoking presentations, riveting performances, and engaging dialogue. By night, the conference continues with after-hours networking opportunities during street festivals, parties, and musical events. To learn more about Expo, visit cityworksexpo.com. Expo 2014 was made possible by these fine sponsors.
So I thought I would start by telling you a little bit about myself to give me some credibility. I hope that's okay. My interest in cities began really early on when I used to play with Lego blocks when I was little instead of Barbie dolls, and my mother said, "You should be an architect." And so, like all good girls, I followed her advice and I became an architect. But for me, that was just the beginning of the journey. Architecture seemed, how can I say, a very small piece of a much larger picture. And after completing a 6-year degree, I decided I needed to learn about how cities worked. So I took myself to Columbia University in New York City and completed a master's in urban design. And urban design is really the design of public spaces. It's how buildings are put together to make cities places that people can be in. Along the way, I worked for architects and then moved to Pittsburgh and eventually took a job with the planning department, which was an amazing job. There I really learnt to understand how cities work and how policies are made and how things happen. At the same time, I also helped to launch a nonprofit CDC. So I was looking at this from both ends, you know, how administrations make policy and how small neighborhoods get things done. So this talk that I'm going to tell you about is really my theory about cities. And I call it small versus big because, as you can see, I think the small can be very big. So there are two ways to develop a city. The first is a top-down approach, and it's sort of the big administrative top-down approach to a city where there are lots of visionary thinkers thinking about how to build stadiums and boulevards and museums and all of those big infrastructure projects that are an important part of the city. I'm not working this properly. I think it's stuck. Okay, sorry. These are also the sorts of projects that you see everywhere in every city. Every city wants a stadium, every city has a museum or a boulevard. And so they're not distinct. They don't differentiate one city from the next. Or you can look at bottom-up projects. These are the tiny little projects that take fire in some obscure corner of the city. It could be an art gallery that becomes Gallery Row, or a coffee shop that's so popular that lots of other businesses spring up around it. And eventually those little projects can stitch together the larger assets of a city, and I believe can have a much bigger impact than just the tiny projects that they are. And I believe these little projects are what makes cities unique. This thing is really sticky, sorry. So I think that every city should have both. They're both as important as each other. But our city officials are really not trained as civic designers or architects or even entrepreneurial thinkers. And so they see what other cities have and they want the same thing, and they really only understand that that's what they can have. I think that's a shame that they don't have anyone by their sides who can explain to them what small projects can bring to cities. So I'm going to go through a series of projects here, the first being the cost of a very large top-down project. I hope there are not too many sports fans in the audience because this is an arena, but I wanted to explain to you the cost to you, the taxpayer, or the cost to any taxpayer in any city of a large top-down project and how they work. So this particular project is the home of the ice hockey team in Pittsburgh called the Penguins, and it's the CONSOL Energy Center. It was built about 4 years ago and replaced a very large 1950s building that was torn down. It sits in a neighborhood right next to downtown called Uptown. It's a very blighted neighborhood. And the arena was put there with the promise that people would see change and it would bring economic development and a whole lot of other stuff. Well, it pretty well much looks like that today, 4 years later. And it's still not a place where people want to linger. So people come to games or come to concerts and they leave. They don't really stay in that neighborhood. And now I want to talk to you about how these projects are financed. There's something called the financing gap. These are the funds that can never be recovered, okay? So you can build a building and you can get rent and you can perhaps pay for most of the cost of the building, but typically in blighted neighborhoods, there's a piece of funding that simply won't be recovered. And that's usually paid for with foundation funds, tax dollars, other funds like that are gone. They're gone into the project for whatever the purpose. In this particular instance, the building itself cost $310 million. But if you add up the principal and interest payments on the mortgage that they had to take out on the big loan for that structure over a period of 30 years, and you add to that the cost of maintenance that I'm sure the owner, the Sports Stadium Authority, agreed to with a tenant, the Penguins, and then you deduct from that the 29.5-year rental agreement that the Penguins have on that building, you end up with a $750 million gap. And that gap was funded with taxpayer dollars. So what is the impact of that gap? What value does it bring to a city? Because I'm not saying I'm against that gap. I'm just trying to explain the cost of these projects. In 2013, I think I'm going to look at it in terms of visits because I think it is a really simple way to understand the impact of public buildings. So in 2013, there were 117 events at the CONSOL Energy Center. I actually went online and looked at the calendar and counted them. And the average capacity for those events was 17,000 seats. So I was very generous and said, okay, let's pretend that all the seats were full at every event. So if you assume that number of events and that number of seats over a 29.5-year period, the length of the lease, then that's 1.98 million visits to that particular building. I'm sorry, that's 1.98 million visits per year, or 58 million visits for the life of the building. We have to assume that after 29.5 years, probably the life of that building is over. So we have a gap of $750 million, but you have 58 million visits to the building. So by my calculations, that's a subsidy of $12.78 for every person who visits that building. That's the cost of that building to the taxpayer. So now I'd like to, well, I think we can do a lot better than this. So now I would like to look at some bottom-up projects and go through the numbers on those. The first is a really sort of funky little project called the Waffle Shop. The Waffle Shop was actually an art student project, an art professor at Carnegie Mellon University who selected a storefront in a different neighborhood every term, and his students would design a sort of a project that would interact with the neighborhood, would engage with it. So he really only intended this project to be 6 months long, but it was so successful they stayed for 4 years. And it was indeed a waffle shop, but the waffles were only a way to entice people in the door. What it really was a live streaming TV show where unsuspecting people who came to buy waffles found themselves on the stage being interviewed in this very funky location. The neighborhood it was in was as blighted as the neighborhood that the CONSOL Energy Center was in. No one wanted to visit East Liberty at that time. It was really not a place you would go. And so to make this project happen over the period of 4 years, they raised about $232,000 from foundations, the university, and some local neighborhood sources. And, at the same time, they were making money on the waffles, but they needed these funds to break even. And as I said, they had a 4-year project life, and they counted visits and said they had about 18,200 visits per year. So that's 72,800 visits over, it's supposed to be 4 years, not 5 years, at a cost of $3.19 per project. Another project that I really love is something we call the GARFIELD Night Market. Again, an extremely blighted neighborhood, surrounded by neighborhoods that are sort of booming in Pittsburgh. This little neighborhood is racially divided, topographically divided, and no one really wanted to go into it and visit it. Half the land there is vacant. It's a problem neighborhood. So CityLAB, which is my nonprofit, constructed a project where we decided we would hold a night market once a month. And the market is very purposefully inside the neighborhood. We helped some local neighborhood residents start their own vendor stalls. It had a very particular idea in mind. It's extremely successful. At least 1,000 people visit each night market. I think it's probably more, so I'm being conservative. And the markets are held once a month, 6 months of the year. And the capital invested was around $72,500, most of it up front to buy tents and lanterns and all the initial things to get the market going, and then a smaller amount in the second year. And eventually, the market will be sustainable. In the early years, the vendors could set up their stalls for free. Now they pay a little fee as it's established. So the impact, conservatively, is 6,000 visits per year. And if the market lasts for 5 years, I think it probably will last longer, but again, I'm being conservative. That's 30,000 visits over 5 years, which means that is a cost of $2.42 per visit. In a similar way, the TOONSEUM, which is a wonderful little museum in Pittsburgh, has a similar story to tell. The TOONSEUM was started by Joe Wose, our superhero, who started in the corner of the Children's Museum and eventually took this idea to have a cartoon-only museum into its own storefront, quickly doubled the size, and hopes eventually to be fully sustainable. They have memberships and charge for events and sell special edition things and have a little gift shop. So they're making money. They believe over a period of time that about $1 million of capital will be invested, mostly grant funds, some sponsorships. And they have about 25,000 visits per year. So if this museum has a 20-year project life, that would be 500,000 visits over 20 years. My math is really wrong today, I'm sorry. At a cost of $2 per visit. Another little project called Conflict Kitchen. Tiny little project developed by a couple of artists who decided they would sell food from countries that the US is conflicted with. And they changed up the food every couple of months, and they would get recipes from local people from that country, so it was very authentic food, very, very good food. They'd sort of practice it to make sure they got it right. And then they would have sort of social events around like that. They had a dinner party, for example, in real time with people in Venezuela, and a couple of things like that. Well, this tiny little project made international news. It was pretty amazing. It got so much press. And it brought people to this really forgotten neighborhood right next to the waffle shop. They would wait there for the sandwiches. No one else was on the street. The total invested was $55,000 in grant money. They did make money selling food, but not enough to cover the cost of the kitchen and the startup of the project. I'm sorry, I'm really having a problem with this thing. Okay, they projected about 18,000 visits per year and had a 2-year project life in that location. So the cost of starting up was $1.51 per visit. But the interesting thing about this project is it had a much larger impact. They actually moved their location closer to the university, and I think it's 3 years later now they are doing really well. So the project hasn't died, it's just moved to a stronger location. Probably they have recouped that money by now. And the final project is a tiny house, which I'm in the process of building in Pittsburgh. This tiny house is in Garfield, that very blighted neighborhood where there's a lot of vacant land and no one really knows what to do with it. The reasons for building the tiny house are that I believe there's a need to rebrand the neighborhood so people look at it differently. It has a very bad reputation right now. People don't want to go to it. What's happened with this tiny house, and we haven't even broken ground yet, is pretty remarkable. At this point, there are 8 to 10 people who are working through the process to purchase a vacant lot from the city so they can build their own tiny house. And this is before we've even broken ground. So I think people saw the land in this neighborhood as a liability, and I wanted to shift that thinking to let them see it as an asset, and that is definitely happening. So what's the cost? At this point, just $25,000. We got a grant from Neighborhood Allies, a local foundation. And with that grant, we put money down on the land. We did a lot of research on what tiny house to buy. We decided pretty early on that we were going to build a process that anyone could follow. So we bought plans online after we worked at a community meeting, sort of selecting ones that the community liked the best. We hired an architect to help us make sure that what we built was within zoning code. We didn't want to ask for variances. We wanted to make sure that what we put on that tiny little lot, it's just 20 by 43 feet, actually complied with building code. And what we found is that when you are done with all the side yard and rear yard setbacks, you actually have 336 square feet left over, and that is the size of our tiny house. So we also have money set aside to write a tiny house manual. So this project is not necessarily just about the house, it's how to get other people interested in making a difference in that neighborhood. And I can't really think about this in terms of visits because it's a little different. So I thought maybe the easiest way to think about this, the very fundamental way to think about it, is return on investment in terms of property tax dollars, real estate taxes. So the taxes that would be paid on, well, right now, I should back up a little. So 10 people are individually trying to buy a piece of land to build tiny houses. And I'm working with a partner to build a little village of tiny houses, another 10. So let's assume that over the next 3 years, we'll have 20 tiny houses where there were none in this neighborhood. And if you take the value of the land today and look at real estate taxes paid on that land, it's so ridiculously low, it comes to $435 a year. But post the houses being on them, it will come to about $35,000. This is assuming that each house sells for around $70,000. And that is an annual increase in property taxes of $35,000. And a return on investment of 1,370%, which I think is phenomenal. So just to summarize, this is the cost of these projects, either in foundation dollars or tax dollars or sponsorships. $1.51 for Conflict Kitchen, $2 for TOONSEUM, $2.43 for the night market, $3.19 for the waffle shop, and $12.78 for the Energy CONSOL Center. And tiny houses have this huge ROI. So now I want you to think about what you can build for the cost of one sports arena. You could build 3,233 waffle shops, which would bring 4 times the number of visitors than the CONSOL Center does. You could build 13,000 conflict kitchens, 8.5 times the number of visits to the CONSOL Center. You could build 750 TOONSEUMs, which is 6.5 times the number of visits to the CONSOL Center. 375 million visits, that's a lot of visits. And 10,000 night markets, 310,000 visits. And you could build 75,000 townhouses, tiny houses with a subsidy of $10,000 for each. I think if you gave people $10,000 to build a tiny house on a vacant lot of land, you probably get 75,000 of them. That's 1.4 billion visits to 28,000 unique projects and 75,000 tiny houses. That's not so small anymore. So by now you probably guessed I'm a serial entrepreneur as well. It's a dirty secret. I'm about to launch My Small Change. It's a crowdfunding platform, and it's specifically for equity in transformational projects, just like the ones you saw, except they're real estate. It's called Small Change, and it's going to look like this. And we are going to basically help developers raise equity for projects that can really transform communities. And by transform, I mean a number of ways. It could be historic buildings that are empty and need to be renovated, or they could be buildings that are very green, or they could be buildings that help with transportation issues, or they could be buildings that create jobs. But any project that we will host will have a social impact score along with a financial return. So you could become, or anyone could become, an investor in these projects. You will invest your money, it may be as low as $10, and you will get a check, a return on that investment, just like any investment in any building project. The sorts of projects we're looking at are minimum a tiny house in Garfield, a really wonderful old vacant brewery. It's probably been vacant for about 40 years in an abandoned small town near Pittsburgh. An incredible, iconic department store in Braddock, PA. Have all of you heard about Braddock, PA, and Mayor Fetterman? He should probably be at this event next year, but Mayor Fetterman, Harvard-educated young man, decided that he would take on Braddock, which has to be one of the most blighted towns I've ever seen. There's very little left, and he's single-handedly making change there. This is a building he's purchased and is handing over to a developer to turn into condominiums. And we're going to post it on our site and help raise money, equity for that project. Another terrific project, this building also has been vacant for about 30 years and is going to be converted into a literary center for a nonprofit called the City of Asylum. They invite refugees to Pittsburgh and grant them asylum, and these are all writers and poets. So your small change could also be here. We're looking for projects, so let us know if you have any in mind, and thank you.